Welcome to Haunting Live Podcast, a place where we bring a new paranormal guest each episode to share their journey and experiences. For more Haunting Live real experiences, be sure to follow us on our social, on Instagram, Thread, Facebook, and also Blue Sky. And don't forget to also check us out on our official website, HAUNTINGLIVEPodcast.com.
Hey everyone, check out our merchandise that we have now listed underneath HAUNTINGLIVEPodcast.com. We used to be on Etsy. We are now on HAUNTINGLIVEPodcast.com with our merch store. Check it out. We've got so much items all together with cleansing items and crystals and so much more. Check us out, HAUNTINGLIVEPodcast.com.
Check out Divine Oracle Podcast with your hosts Gypsy Lady Eva and Brother Chris as they discuss spiritual topics and current events. Sit back and listen underneath Podbean and underneath YouTube.
Happy March, you lovers of all things paranormal. My name is Yolanta Meri, and I'd like to welcome you to this stellar episode of the Haunting Live Podcast, hosted by Trevor Bishop. Today's guest isn't just a host of a paranormal podcast, Strange Familiars. He's also a talented folk musician, paranormal investigator, author, and illustrator. His illustrations have appeared in comics, fanzines, magazines, and books. Rumor has it that today we might hear I Have Never Minded the Loneliness. Now that sounds intriguing.
Yes, it does. Yeah. And hello, Tim. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you. We've had you on as a guest before, so welcome back. And you have a brand new book out. So before we get into that, can you tell people a little bit about yourself, your background, and sort of what you do quickly?
Sure. All right, Yolanta covered a good bit of it, but so I grew up in what I call the golden age of Bigfoot. I was born in 1970, a few years after Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed, and grew up watching In Search Of and Legend of Boggy Creek and all those great 70s Bigfoot things. You know, Bigfoot was on the $6 Million Man, all that stuff. And loved it. Loved all that stuff. Loved monsters, loved ghost stories, loved what I would later come to know was called folklore. But at the time, they were just cool stories to me. But I always liked the things that were true, you know, at least true in quotes, at least claimed to be true, whether that was Bigfoot or ghost stories or things like that. So I was really interested in the paranormal when I was young. Didn't know that was what it was, you know. To me, they were just cool things, you know, monsters and ghosts and such. Always been an artist. I think my brother bought me my first comic book. It was a Spider-Man comic when I was 5. I couldn't even read yet, I remember. He had to read it to me. I made him read it to me over and over and over again. And then my mom told me, somebody drew those pictures. I was like, what? Like, there's like the concept of like somebody drew each one of those pictures. I was like, okay, all right, I want to do that. So never really got that great at comic illustration, but as I grew older, I became fascinated in just straight illustration of books, and went to art school and so forth. And yeah, kind of I'm lucky enough to have made my way in the world, and I get to be a podcaster and an author and an illustrator. I'm very happy for it.
Yeah, actually, I noticed you're having a bit of not sure if you call it a contest, but you're releasing some images that you've been drawing for March of monsters. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I came up with the idea. First of all, for those watching this on video, I have a standing desk. So if you see me shift around, I'm not squirming in my chair. I shift on my feet, and I know how that looks. It looks like I'm squirming in my chair, but that's just, the standing desk is better for me. So I'm not squirming in my chair. But in any case, in October, I decided to do what I called Squatchtober and draw a Bigfoot every day for the month. And it went so well that I said, well, I have to do this again. So I decided, let's do Monstrous March. I'm just drawing any, just whatever random monster I want, one a day in March. I love it because it keeps me active and drawing, and it gives people inexpensive art they can buy, and kind of helps support what I'm doing, and they get original art as we go along here.
And where can you find that? On your store?
Yeah. I usually put links up. If you follow me on social media, I put links on Strange Familiars Patreon first, and then the Strange Familiars Discord, but then I go to Facebook and Instagram. So if you follow Strange Familiars on either of those places, they come up every day, and it's a random time. It's whatever, basically whatever time I finish it is when it goes up. Sometimes it's a little after midnight. Sometimes it's, well into the following day.
Now, Tim, two things. How would you describe your art? I've seen it. It looks really cool. To me, it's a little bit retro. It's really a vibe I do enjoy. And secondly, out of all the monsters in folklore, what's your favorite one?
Okay, so my art is hopefully very much inspired by what they call the golden age of illustration, which is the late 1800s, about 1870 or so through maybe 1920. And some of the greatest illustrators of all time come from there. And that's where I take my illustration influences from, along with comics and some other, modern sources. But that mainly what they call the golden age of illustration there. So if it looks retro, it's because I'm doing it the old way. I'm not using a computer. I'm doing brush and ink and pen and ink, and that's the way I like to do it, on paper, or illustration boards sometimes. And as far as monsters, I always have to go Bigfoot. I love Bigfoot. Can't get enough of Bigfoot. I've written several books on Bigfoot. I'll write more yet. When I finished Where the Footprints End with Josh, I said, I'm done with Bigfoot. I've said everything I want to say, but that's not true. I will be returning to Bigfoot very shortly here.
Have you ever met Bigfoot?
Not personally. Never shook his hand. I am waiting for a really definite, like, face to face, that's what it was. I can't say it wasn't anything else, kind of sighting. But that has not happened. I've caught glimpses of things that make me go, that seemed too big, for something in the woods here in Pennsylvania. But, I've not had that really good, clear, face to face kind of sighting that, I hope to get someday.
Now, have you seen somebody else's evidence that would convince you without a doubt that they had seen Bigfoot?
Well, so with me and Bigfoot, it's an interesting thing because I will sound like a skeptic. When you talk to me, I'll sound like, oh, you sound just like those skeptics, but I'm a firm believer. I'm an absolute believer in Bigfoot. I also believe it's probably not some sort of undiscovered primate or relic hominid or something we can put in a cage. In my view, there's something very, very strange about the creature. So when we talk about evidence, best evidence we have are footprints, and there's some really great ones I've seen. There's the dermal ridges and all these things that primate foot experts get excited about. But I always like to point out the way they used to hunt ghosts in the 1950s. They'd put powder on the floor and footprints would appear. So, just because there's a footprint doesn't mean we have something that's not somewhat ephemeral. So, yeah, it leaves footprints, it leaves hair, it leaves scat behind, but we don't have one in a cage. I don't think we ever will. I think there's something very strange about it. So, evidence, I'm more into witness testimony, and I know science hates that because it's inconsistent, right? But the thing about Bigfoot is, if you look at it over the course of hundreds of years, and you look at what people are saying, you get this sort of catalog list of behaviors with it. They react very badly to dogs. They don't like dogs, often killing them or harming them. They climb on people's roofs, which is a weird thing. Like, why does they climb on the roof? Beat on the side of houses, and you get this pattern of behavior over centuries where people are talking about this thing. Then you go, okay, so witness accounts are unreliable, but when you have hundreds of witness accounts over centuries, and they start talking about these very specific things, very odd things, and I know some of these accounts I collected from old newspapers, modern witnesses weren't digging through old newspapers to find the stuff until I published it. No one knew, no one was reading it. And I published it, and these accounts were already out there on, Sasquatch Chronicles and these other places. I'm looking at these old accounts and go, oh my gosh, people talk about that in modern times. So that's what's interesting to me. The consistency of sort of the behaviors and the effects around the creature over hundreds of years convinced me that people are talking about, something out there.
Well, that's just it. Like, they've been reporting them for centuries now, like back to the 1800s and prior, so they just went under a different name at that time. And how did you come across learning that that's what they called them back then? Like, did you do your own research to determine that?
So my first book was about Toad Road here in York County, Pennsylvania. It's just a strange place. And the second half of that book, I went looking for any other kind of weird stuff that happened. So the first talks about that legend and everything around it. In the second half, I was like, well, let's go beyond that legend and look at other weird reports. And I started noticing all these reports of what they were calling wild men. And now I'm not the first person, and I'm not the only person to recognize this. People, in the 70s and before started digging these newspaper accounts out. But for me, that's how I sort of discovered them for myself as I'm doing research for my first book. And I started saying, well, these are Bigfoot reports, and then I started collecting those for the whole state. And I did Bigfoot in Pennsylvania, which is just a collection of old newspaper reports and my commentary. And then I did one for the West Coast, Bigfoot West Coast Wildman. It's the same. It's for California, Oregon, and Washington State. And eventually I'll get more done. I'm going to do Wildmen of the East Coast, I think, next coming up here. So it'll be the entire East Coast.
Cool. So then you jumped into your latest book, which we'll get to next here, and which is on the topic of hermits. So for those that might not understand what hermits are, can you go into a little bit of detail about that and sort of explain the background of hermits and what it's all about?
Yeah. So asked, I've been asked several times as I've done interviews for this book, what is a hermit? I think most people have an idea. Somebody, usually it's a, grizzled old guy who lives out in the woods alone or something. And very basically, my definition is someone who wants to live alone. And it's a very basic definition, but that's because as I did research on these hermits, I found most of them do live out in the woods alone. But some of them live in cities. They just live alone. Some of them live, right outside of town. They just live alone. So, the general description is it's just someone who wants to live alone, I think, is my best definition of a hermit. I became interested in them through actually a paranormal connection because when I was writing those books on the old wild men, my wife bought a photo of a hermit. It's William Woodruff from Colebrook River, Connecticut. And she put it on my desk and she said, "This guy looks like a wild man. You'll like him." And just sat it there. And it got shuffled under papers and months went by and it shuffled to the top of the pile. And my desk is a mess, as you might imagine from that. And I had a few minutes that day. I picked it up and I said, I'm going to see if I can find anything on this guy. And I typed it in and these stories started coming up, these newspaper articles about this guy. I was like, well, he has this incredible life story. So it started out with that, with her saying, oh, it's a wild man. And then, but the interesting thing about him, and this is the first hermit I researched, himself was mistaken for a wild man. They were having a wild man flap in Winstead, Connecticut, which is, I think it's about 7 miles from Colebrook River, Connecticut. And he lived on the road between the two towns. And one day he came out of the woods. Well, someone came out of the woods and it was clearly a human. He was wearing overalls and was, had his hand in his pocket, and they say he had a long beard. Scared people because they're having this wild man flap. He walks out of the woods, and whatever passerby like scared him to death because they thought it was the wild man coming out of the woods, and they reported in the paper. And I'm not 100% certain it's him. It certainly sounds like him, and he would have been in the right place for that. So I think there's this wild man connection to the first hermit I started researching. So it kind of all came together for me there with my wild man research, and then from there, I just got interested in other hermits. I started collecting other photographs. My wife and I, today, the reason I was a little bit late to our interview, I was at a photo convention today outside of Washington, D.C. We collect antique photographs, and I started collecting hermits. And then I said, I should write all of these guys and women. There's women too. All of these people have great stories. They have great life stories, like really interesting. And eventually I said, I got to write a book. And then I based it on my photo collection. Almost everybody, I think there's 3 or 4 hermits in the book out of 38 or something I write about that don't have photos. But every other hermit in there, you can actually see what they look like. Often you see where they lived and so forth. Because I have this pretty massive hermit photo collection at this point.
Would it have been hard to get a photo of something like that in those days? Like, would it be easy for them to take a camera and go ask them to take a photo, or how hard would that have been in those days to do that?
Yeah, so most of these hermits are from the mid 1800s up to again 1920 or so. Every town had a newspaper, and didn't have the internet back then. Even little towns had newspapers, and every town wanted human interest stories. And almost every town had a hermit, and at some point they went, "Oh, there's that old guy who lives up on the mountain there. We should go do a story about him. What's his story? Why does he live alone?" So they sent a reporter out, and sometimes they were right, and they actually printed the real story. Often they printed legends, and that was a big part of what I did was sort of trying to sort the legend from the true story of their lives as much as I could. This sometimes they had photographers on staff of the newspaper, or sometimes because of the newspaper articles, they would generate interest in these people, and the town photographer would then go take a photo of them, and then they would sell them right from the storefront of the photographer. They'd sell them, for they were like a dime or something back then, and sometimes the hermits themselves would buy the photos in quantity and they would sell them. A couple of these guys made their living basically selling their photo to people who come by and visit them.
Sort of like a little souvenir kind of thing for coming to see them.
Yeah, and because they were such a curiosity and so local, there's a lot more hermit photos than you would imagine out there. A lot, especially around 1903 or 4. What they call the real photo postcard. So it's a postcard, but it's an actual real photograph. So photographers are able to make these postcards. And once they start happening, then you really get hermits, because then they have all kinds of local interest stuff. These photographers, they would sell them at drugstores, and the photographers and all this stuff. So they would just, like I said, almost every town had a hermit. So, you get these local interest photos, of hermits from different places.
That's cool. Cool. Out of the stories that you researched, which is one of your favorite ones?
So my favorite has to be William Woodruff. He's the first one, but my second favorite is a man named John Stink, and they called him the living ghost. So here we got a ghost thing, and he was an Osage Indian. His native name was Hotamoi, and he died and came back to life. And it depends on which newspaper you read. He died up to 3 different times and came back to life. And I have in this book, in my research, so I'll just count here rather than read them all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So 14 different ways the newspapers reported that he died. Some of these are definitely legends. Some of these definitely aren't true. But in all these legends, and some of them are, he died of different diseases, and it was pneumonia, smallpox. They had him done, all these different things. And basically, all the stories end with him being buried or put in some kind of like a stone, burial ground kind of thing, where they just covered with stones, and he wakes up. He was a very big, very strong man, and walks back into the community afterwards. And I have to say, I'm not familiar with the Osage beliefs on death. I only can report what was reported in the newspapers. So I'm not sure how accurate this is, but according to the newspapers, the Osage people basically said, you leave, go away, because once you're dead, you should stay dead. The dead shouldn't come back to life. And then they renamed him from Hotamoi. They said, no, John Stink. So you smell the dead, John Stink. So he became a hermit, and he was around the town of Pawhuska, Oklahoma, lived on the streets there. Now, by choice, he camped out by choice. In the early 1900s, there was an oil strike on Osage land, and they became per capita about the richest people in the world, including John Stink. They all got a portion of this oil money. So he had plenty of money. He could have lived in a mansion. He just wanted to live outside. And he had a pack of dogs that he lived with. And I found a notice in the Pawhuska paper. They were having a rabies outbreak. And they said, look, due to the rabies outbreak, all dogs have to be muzzled except John Stink's dogs. They made a specific exception for him. They said his dogs don't have to be muzzled. He was with them all the time. They were super well trained. Everybody knew John Stink and his dogs. So they said all dogs must be muzzled except for John Stink's dogs. Well, a little bit after that, it's really, really sad. There's a marshal in town. I'm trying to find the blanket. And he shoots the dogs. He shoots and kills the dogs. So this is 1914. An off-duty city marshal shot John 7 dogs with a repeating rifle. The lawman stated that he thought John was being attacked by the canines, but as John and his dogs were well known about the town, this is difficult to believe. The Pawhuska Capital printed an article attributed to John Stink in which he describes the incident. He says, on last Friday evening, an unlucky day, as the sun was sinking in the west, while wending my lonesome, well-defined and trodden path from the city to nature's unpretentious couch on Bird Creek, happy and in love with nature, and with my splendid dumb friends frisking at my feet, and then they don't name the marshal, so it's like the unnamed marshal. tracked and waylaid me just beyond the Bird Creek Bridge, and without warning, with premeditation and cold-blooded and unfeeling barbarism and brutal roughness, pointed and fired and continued to fire deadly lead from repeating rifles into the frightened but loyal friends, believing I was being attacked as the poor unprotected creatures scurried back and forth around my feet in an effort to protect me until the fiendish work was completed and my friends lay quivering in the dust, their lifeblood ebbing forth. So from that point on, he makes the vow. He says, I will not return to Pawhuska. And he doesn't, except for one time. I could find one time he returned to town. He leaves, he goes off to the wilds, and there's even again in the newspapers like, where's John Stink? They're looking for him. Like, where did he go? And he made this vow. He's like, I will not return to town. He lived out by himself. Eventually, he gathered more dogs. They said basically any dog that found its way to John Stink found a home. So he loved dogs. Very imposing guy. He stood, 6 feet taller. Had a knife on his hip, and eventually he buys some property and just puts a barbed wire fence up. So a lot of the photos of him are him standing at the barbed wire fence, looking very imposing. But he was a super nice guy. He gave $1,000 to every church in Pawhuska, which back then was a huge amount of money, 1910 or so. He paid tuition for Osage girls to go to private school. He just outright paid their tuition. And I think he was responsible for building what they call the American Legion hut, the American Legion building there. So, very generous man, and it seems like he just wanted to live alone. Ends up dying at his funeral. They said his dogs were right there at his coffin. They had a Catholic ceremony and an Osage ceremony for him both. And then he's buried in the mausoleum in Pawhuska, which they said only the wealthiest people in town were buried there. So it's a pretty incredible story of a guy who was in some way outcast, or maybe he just decided he wanted to live alone, and but lives this pretty amazing life on his own terms.
Oh, wow.
Really interesting story. And that was the final time he passed away. He finally actually did pass.
Yeah, yeah, and interesting. There's no ghost stories about him around the town, but there's ghost stories about his dogs around the town. They say you can still hear his dogs howling around.
Oh, wow.
That's cool.
Even though they called him the living ghost, and he returned several times. But yeah, when he finally died, he died in let's see, April of '38. He fell and broke his leg, so he made it to 1938. He was 75 years old at the time, but he contracted pneumonia basically from that incident, and ended up dying in September of 1938. So he's one of the ones that lived. A couple of them in this book made it to, I think one might have made it to the 50s. I have in here, but most of them didn't make it past 1920 or so.
A very interesting story. How would you compare nowadays, I guess, like people that are homeless or choose to live on their own like that, to people that did that back then? Would you compare it to the same level, or is there a different level to it these days?
I think it's very different, because I think back then there was more. I won't say we were freer, but we were less litigious. And it seems like these people could just walk out and build a cabin wherever. And even if it was on somebody's property, a lot of times they were just like, oh, okay, well, you're not hurting anything. Go ahead and stay there. Even if it was on like state parkland or something, well, he's not hurting anything. He can stay there. Nowadays, I think you don't have it as much because, and maybe this is necessary because of how litigious we are. I've seen more no trespassing signs since the pandemic than I've ever seen before. It's very frustrating to me, but I also understand it because I know how people are. You go into somebody's property, you break your ankle. Some people are going to, rather than say, oh, I goofed, my mistake,
Yeah.
I broke my ankle. Some people are going to go, I'm going to sue that guy. I broke my ankle on his property. So I understand on one level why that is. But I do think these people are a product of the times. I don't think it could happen nowadays in many cases. You'll hear about modern hermits here and there. There was one up in Maine a few years ago, and he had lived as a hermit for like over a decade, but they finally caught him, and he was basically breaking into people's summer homes when they weren't there just to get food. He wasn't, stealing anything of value, but they finally caught him and, basically said, you can't live like that. So I think it's just that they were a product of the time. I just don't think it can happen these days. It's not quite the same as being homeless. There was an itinerant hermit in the book, the old Leatherman, and he walked around New York and New England and New York and Connecticut in a loop. I think it was every 34 days he made a loop, and he like clockwork. He would be they planted crops by this guy. He was that regular. He walked 10 miles a day. He had a big leather suit that he sewed himself. Like he took the tops out of old boots and made this patchwork leather suit. The suit itself weighed something like 60 pounds. All leather, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. Leather's not great insulator. And made his own boots with wooden soles. So if you think about that, they're completely inflexible. So he's basically stomping 10 miles a day in these boots. But he chose to live that life, and apparently he never begged. He would stop at the same houses if somebody had given him tobacco or food before, he might stop at that house. But he didn't stop at any new houses. Never begged, never revealed anything about himself. He is a rarity. Even these folks from the 1800s, most of them I can find. I can find them in the census records. I can find death certificates. You can find they'll pop up here and there. If they were employed, we can sometimes find that. If they're immigrants, sometimes we can even find the ship they came over on. But the Leatherman is a true mystery. There was an article written about him. He pops up in the 1860s and just starts walking around, and he sees this curiosity in this leather suit. And somebody writes an article in the 1880s called Mystery Solved, and they tell a story about the Leatherman. They said, oh yeah, his name was James Bourgelat or Jacques Bourgelat, and he was involved in the leather industry in France, and it all went wrong, and he came to America, and he walks this loop as a penance because he basically was supposed to marry this woman. Her father was a leather merchant, and he made bad investments, and the leather market crashed, and he lost all his money, and so he supposedly does this loop as penance. And they said Jules Bourgelat, that was his name. They said, and newspaper articles up into the 1980s printed that as his story. Jules Bourgelat. This is the story. It's completely made up. The guy who wrote it, 100% fiction. We know he spoke French. He had a French accent, and we know he was Catholic because when they found him when he was dead, he had a scapular on and a French Catholic prayer book in his pocket. That's all we know about him. We don't know his name. Nothing. They exhumed him sometime within the last 10 years or so. They were going to try to get any part of him, do some DNA, and find out who this guy was. He had completely returned to the earth. The only thing they found in his grave were coffin nails from the wooden coffin that had rotted away. So they reburied him, and the old tombstone said Jules Bourgelat, but the new one actually just says the Leatherman, because we do not know his name, and that was not his name. So he is a true mystery, an absolute true mystery. We will never know who he was. There's no way. Which is a real rarity. Even, like I said, even from folks of the 1800s, we can figure out a good bit about him. But he will remain a mystery forever. He's just the Leatherman.
Very interesting.
And I mean, right now, I think Leatherman would scare a lot of people if we had someone with that sort of an image walking around with horror movies prevalent. But from my understanding, people kind of welcomed him, or they did just look forward to him coming. So he just had a completely different vibe than.
Yeah, he looks imposing. He looks, just because of the way his suit is, he looks like he'd be a very heavy set guy. But it's just the way the big leather coat lays on him. He wasn't. But he did look imposing, but apparently he was very kind to kids. I found stories of kids who said they would eat lunch. He wouldn't speak to them, but he would sit there quietly and eat lunch with them and share whatever food he had with the kids. Like I said, he never begged. He has a very sad ending in that at some point you start noticing it in photos, his lip swells and it ends up being cancer. And they said towards the end, he was laying a piece of leather over his lip so he could drink coffee and soup and stuff. And eventually they find him in one of his caves. He stayed in a series of caves and lean-to shelters on his route. And they found him in one of his caves, I think in Sing Sing, New York, and he just died. The cancer finally just took him out. But he was beloved. He was absolutely beloved. When he died, they took, I think, one of the dime museums in New York bought his suit, and then it just disappeared. We don't know where his suit is. A couple of the historical societies up in Connecticut have like his mittens and his boots, and I think maybe his hat and his pipe. But the suit is, no one knows where it is at this point.
Very interesting. So that was sort of local to New York region, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. New York and Connecticut was his route. He would kind of walk in a route. And
Are,
again, we don't, with the French accent, he could have walked down from Canada.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
that's what I mean. Like, how regional
yeah.
is this stuff? Is it all spread out all over the country in the U.S., or is it all into our country too,
Oh,
Canada? Or
yeah, I have hermits from Europe in there. I have a couple from England, one from Brittany. I have some one from France, yeah, from Brittany and France. But I had some others from France. But it's so hard to I don't speak French, and to translate those newspaper articles is very very difficult. So there's photos of quite a few in there that I didn't get to write full stories for. There's a whole chapter just like miscellaneous hermits, whatever information I could find on them that wasn't a full chapter. But yeah, they were all over the place, mainly concentrated in, as far as America goes, in New England though, which is interesting. I don't know whether that's part of that whole New England sense of stubbornness and freedom, and we're going to do things our way and be independent, or I just don't know why that is. As I'm reading this, I'm like, why wouldn't you move south? That's a hard life,
I
and
was gonna say, it's a harsh life. You got to be outside in all weather and all elements, like
yeah.
all year long. Like, it's got to be really tough.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I'd say probably better than 50% of the hermits in the book are New England, and it's just I don't know why that is. It's interesting though.
That's fascinating. Out of all the books that you've written, what are the most interesting things that you have learned through research?
Researching, say for the Hermit book, is very different than for Bigfoot or any of the paranormal book. With them, it's like say with Where the Footprints End, it's the High Strangeness Bigfoot book that I wrote with Josh Cutchin, the 2 volumes. That's just kind of like, well, we have this theory, or we have these Bigfoot reports that show this weird behavior. Let's find other reports, and what can we say about that? With the hermits, it's a very specific kind of research in that these were people. They were born on a certain date. They died on a certain date. They lived a life. They lived in a certain area, and it's very specific facts. And the most difficult part of all of it is deciding when I had enough information. When did I have enough? Did I get everything on this person? Or is there more out there and I'm sure with more than one, I'm sure there's more out there that I didn't find. But it's a very different kind of research, and it's very time consuming because of that. It took me a long time to write this book, over 3 years of just pretty intense research and writing and illustration. But like I said, it's a different kind of research, and in a way, it's a little more rewarding. Not that I like it more. I love paranormal stuff. I will get back to writing paranormal books, but it's rewarding in as much as like I feel like there's this concept of second death. You die once and then you die again when everybody forgets you. I feel like, oh, I'm saving these folks from second death. I'm rediscovering these stories, and in that way, it feels very rewarding. It's like, oh my gosh, I get to tell this guy's story, and maybe somewhere down the line, somebody else reads this book and gets excited, and maybe they'll find some more hermits they want to write about or something. But so it's a different kind of thing, but it's like I said, it's rewarding, I guess, in a different way, this kind of research. But as far as any specific thing, I mean, just figuring the way these guys and women, the way these folks live their life on their own terms, is just so exciting. And they just like, I've just walked away from everything. I'll just, I can make my way. And they do, where there's a will, there's a way, I suppose.
yeah, there's some envy there, I think, eh? So, like, they get to live their life the way they want to, not the way they're forced to. So,
Yeah, yeah. And again, I think it was easier to do at that time. It's just somewhat easier. People left people alone a little bit more.
well, thank you for sharing the stories in your book. And can you tell people where they can find it if they want to purchase it from you?
Sure. Sure. I have never minded loneliness, hermits and their stories. You can find it on Amazon. You can order it into your local bookstore. You can get it directly from me. Strangefamiliars.com is the easiest place to find me, and all the links go to stuff that's all me there. So any link there is associated with me. So you'll find it at strangefamiliars.com.
Awesome.
It was really awesome talking to you, Tim Renner. And how often is your, because you did pitch Strange Familiars, just so everybody knows, how often is your podcast posted? How often? What can they expect from that too, quickly?
So weekly, And the main thing I do is mostly I talk to witnesses of the paranormal, whatever that is. It can be ghosts, Bigfoot, UFOs, whatever it is. I like to get witness accounts straight from the witness, but I also like to go out to places, and there was whether it's a haunted place or maybe there was a Bigfoot encounter there, and record and see what happens. So sometimes you get to hear us go to these places and record, and those are my favorite shows to do. But you can go to a place 10 or 20 times before something happens that's worth doing a podcast over. Sometimes you go and there's not much to report, but so you get a little bit of that and a lot of witness interviews and so forth. So this weekly show, I'm loving it. I haven't gotten tired of it yet after 500 and however many episodes. 518, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you just crossed your milestone there a while ago, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Tim. We'll have you back again when you got a new book out or something, so or if you just want to come back on as a guest and talk about paranormal stuff. So thank you for coming on.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Miss one of our episodes? Replay your episodes on Rhode Island Broadcasting. Show your support for Haunting Live by supporting our broadcast partner, Rhode Island Broadcasting. Find them on YouTube. For more Haunting Live real experiences, be sure to follow us on our social on Instagram, Thread, Facebook, and also Blue Sky. And don't forget to also check us out on our official website, hauntinglivepodcast.com.